All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Again, this is the Implementation Tips, Tricks, and Gotchas webinar presented by Norm Goddard. It's going to be on IBM Cognos Analytics today. I'm Caroline Wright. I'm going to be helping kick things off here. Before we start, a few housekeeping things I wanted to go over. All of your lines will remain muted throughout the webinar. We expect to run about 45 minutes and have reserved some time for Q&A at the end. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout via the chat window, and then we will answer all of them when we get to the end of the webinar. Or if we don't have enough time, then we'll be answering via email afterwards. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be available to you after the webinar. We will send you a copy tomorrow via email. Here's a quick look at what we're going to be driving through. Let me go over to our agenda slide real quick. So first, I'll kick things off with a little bit of introduction, and then Norm's going to go through some installation considerations when you're implementing Cognos Analytics, break down some of the new configuration differences between Cognos version 10 and version 11, and then he's going to give a demonstration of some report upgrades live. Then we'll go into our Q&A. I did want to give you a quick introduction into our company. Before we get started, Norm and I both work for Convergence Consulting Group, CCG. We're based out of our headquarters here in Tampa Bay. We're a data and analytics consulting firm that helps customer organizations overcome business challenges by transforming data into valuable insights. We're vendor agnostic and an IBM partner. We specialize in helping companies across the U.S. achieve real business outcomes with tools like IBM Cognos Analytics, SAP, Microsoft, MicroStrategy. We were one of the first to implement IBM Cognos Analytics earlier this year, so everything that you're hearing today is a result of true experience from customer engagement. I'm now going to go ahead and introduce Norm, who is your speaker today. Norm and I have had the pleasure of working together for a couple of months now, and this is our first webinar together. Norm has been in the consulting business for over 19 years. He's a senior BI architect here at CCG. He was previously a solution architect with RealPage Incorporated and an education delivery manager for IBM. So he worked for IBM and Cognos BI previously in his career. So all of his experience today comes from over nearly 10 years at least of working with these tools. So a lot of experience. Definitely take advantage of asking him questions today. I'm now going to hand it over to Norm to go ahead and get this thing started.
Okay. Thank you, Caroline. One of the first things, just to give you a little bit of a background about one of our first things that we did here. This is one of the first Cognos 11 installations that was done, and it was a rather large company as well, national company. We also had there was an additional component to this beyond Cognos 11 where we were doing it in the software environment as well, which is the infrastructure as a service, if you're not familiar with that. So there was some different challenges, obviously, with new versions, some things to learn, and so that's what we've put this together to try and help people kind of get over some of those fears or maybe over the hump of actually going and upgrading. So we wanted to go over some of the benefits of the new version, what some of the some of the gotchas are, some of the changes, some of the configuration changes, things like that. So one of the first things here is just a quick look at what our architecture was, or in one of the environments, because there's actually 4 environments, and this sort of thing is pretty typical for most people to have 3, maybe 4 different environments to move stuff from development through testing process and so on, all the way up to production. For anyone that's familiar, that isn't new to Cognos, this should look familiar because the architecture is still the same as far as having a web tier, an application tier, the data tier, and so on. Because this was a larger environment where we had 2 gateways, we had 4 application servers, and so on. We have a load balancer that's necessary for the gateways because we've got more than one. And one change you'll see that I'll get into is this load balancer that's between the gateways and the application servers. This is something that people would do in past, version 10, version 8, and so on. But it was something that was optional. Currently in the Cognos Analytics 11, that is not optional when you have more than one application server. There's also a couple other things that have changed in this architecture, things that are optional and so on, depending on what you're doing. And so we'll get into some of that as well. So first off, and this is one of the big changes, is that the gateway component of IBM Cognos is actually something that is optional now. They've created something they're calling this glass interface that's hosted on the application tier, and so that allows your gateway to be optional, so that you could set up and have a single application server, content manager, and just go with that. Your URL is a little different, where you're hitting the dispatcher URL as opposed to a gateway URL. Of course, that can be changed as well. To have like some sort of redirect. But there are some instances where the gateway actually is required, and see I've got them listed here. And the single sign-on is one of the reasons that we had gateways, because we had the single sign-on set up using Active Directory as the security source as well. So in this case, we had to use the gateway components. But there are some other things, if you're making your stuff publicly available outside your firewall, you probably want to have a gateway as well. Or if you're putting static content on the web server, third-party portal integration, and so on. So now we've got a couple of poll questions that we want to ask, and just kind of get some information from those that are attending, and then we'll continue on.
All right, here are the results of the first poll. The question was, do you plan to upgrade to IBM Cognos Analytics in, and half of you said by the end of 2016, and then the other half said in 2017, which is about what we were expecting. We've got one more quick question to ask you guys while we're on a poll break, and I'll go ahead and launch that now. Do you or your users use query analysis or Event Studio? So 100% of you said yes. There you go, Norm. I'll hand the screen back over to you to continue.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that last one, that's about what I expected to, with people looking to upgrade. And so that kind of leads into this next piece. When you're running through the installation and, you've got your different options in your install screens as you go through, they've changed how this works compared to version 10x and previously. And even within the different releases of Cognos 11, this has changed. The install that we first did back at the beginning, towards the beginning of the year, that was on the GA release, and there's some things that have actually changed in the 11.0.3 release, which is the current one that came out, I believe it was in July. That's the other thing, if you haven't been following any of this, the releases within Cognos 11 are a lot quicker than what we're used to previously from IBM. It seems to be approximately every couple months there's a new release that is actually coming out and it's the typical, it's got the bug fixes and so on, but it's also got a lot of new features available as well. And I've seen quite a change actually from the general release up to what we're dealing with in the most current one. So when you're running through the install screens, one of the first things it will do after you specifying the path you want to put it in and so on is it gives you this option where you kind of need, it's a roadmap, and you basically kind of need to choose now. There's an easy install option. This is what I was referring to in previous versions of 11. They called it ready to run. They're calling it easy install now. So they have made some, a little bit of configuration changes to this and so even by the time you go to upgrade, either later this year or next year, it's possible this could change even more based on feedback and stuff from existing people installing. So what the easy install does, though, it's good if you want to just get a quick up and running environment just to kind of look at things, because what it does, it puts the full version of IBM Cognos on there. It also does an install and configuration for your content store. It creates an Informix installed content store, and it also puts Apache directory server on there for you to use as a security source as well for the environment, if you will. So this is a good one, to do like POC type things and so on as well. So this might be something that you do if you want to get just a quick sandbox up and running and, just to kind of look at things. But this custom install option, this is the one, and the reason I asked about, the legacy tools, Query Studio, and so on, because if you're not familiar with it, in version 11, all those tools, Query Studio, Analysis Studio, Event Studio, and so on, they're all not there. If you do the easy install, get it up and running, those tools are not available because they assume that those are new customers. When you do a custom install, that's where you can go and choose your components you can that you want to install, similar to what we're used to in the version 10 releases. But this is also the one that's recommended for existing customers because this is the one that actually enables those legacy components by default. And they actually made that legacy switch difficult by default. There is a support document on IBM's site on how to change that. It requires triggering some JSON commands and different things. So it's not exactly a trivial thing to do. But if you do the custom install, it automatically has those legacy components on. So, and you'll see when we get to the demo, if you haven't seen how the interface looks yet in 11, when you do a new, there's an other option. When you select other, that's where you'll see the different legacy studios. Of course, there's some things that control that as well. The security, if the user has the capabilities to actually use those tools, then they'll show up there. And then there is browser specific as well, where in Chrome, a couple of those studios don't show up. And I forget the exact which ones they are, but in IE and Firefox they do. And that was the same thing in earlier releases of in version 10 and whatnot as well, that some of those menus, some of the tools available vary depending on the browser as well. So when you do the easy install and go down that path, then it also gives you a couple of choices as you're stepping through this. So the first one is then saying, well, this is just the first install, and so what that will do is it puts all the components on a single server, and then you also have to then just create your user ID and password that you want to use to sign in to your Cognos Analytics environment. And then once you get past that, then it's just install, and it installs and configures everything for you. So like I said, it's just a quick, easy, up and running kind of POC type of thing. There's also a connect and install option when you're going through that easy install, and that's for you to expand on a running environment. And so in there, what you'll need to do is provide your URL for your environment, and then of course the ID password that you created for that environment. One thing you'll notice different, the URL that I have there, that's not the typical IBM Cognos CGI or if you're using CGI bin or ISAPI or whatever. This is the URL where we're going directly against the dispatcher. So in this particular install, this was a sandbox that I was doing in our CCG environment here. We didn't have the gateways installed. We're just using the application tier and the content manager. And so that application tier has that glass interface for the web, for the gateway component and so on. And so that's where things start to get a little bit different when it comes to that. When you do a custom install and you choose the other path, and more than likely for anyone that's experienced in installing Cognos before, this was probably the path that you'll go down all the time. This is the one that I use for all the installs that I've done. It then gives you two choices under that as well. And the first one is again, it's a first install. But on this one, because when you choose the first install, you'll notice, and this is different even within the version 11 releases. In the GA release, we could select whatever components we want. This has been changed slightly now, where when you do you have this first install option under here. The content manager is not optional because it's required, because it's saying, well, I don't have anything to connect to, I don't have any other components, so it assumes, well, you have to have the content manager, so it's going to force the install on that particular server. Then you can also include an application tier or the gateway if needed, in this particular one. So like in that architecture slide I had at the beginning there, where we had 4 application servers, 1 content manager, and we also had a standby content. One of the app servers was a standby content manager as well. Using this version, I wouldn't select anything here. I would just go ahead and go and install the content manager on that particular machine. And then when it came to the other machines, then I would use the connect and install. And so in that case, I want to expand on an existing environment. And again, this is where things get a little bit different, where prior to how they've got things set up here, I could go and install all the components that I needed on all my different servers. I didn't have to get any of them up and running yet, so I could run through the install and do all that stuff and get the files there, and then go back and then configure them in the order that they need to be done, the content store, the primary content manager first, then the standby and the application servers and so on. Now it's slightly different, because when I come in here and I want to do the connect and install, it lets me go and select the different components that I want on this next server that I'm expanding with. However, you need to have your primary content manager configured and actually running when you do this, because it's the next piece is that it's going to ask you, well, what are you actually connecting to? And so at that point, when you're connecting, you have to put in your URL, you have to put in an appropriate user ID and password, administrator ID and password to actually connect to it before you can actually actually install these different components. So, if you do installations like me, I like to just kind of run the installs, get the different components on the different machines, and then I start at my primary content manager and start doing my configuration. Well, now I have to change that slightly, where I install the primary content manager, configure it, and start it, and then I can go back and do the rest of it. So it's a little bit different than what we're typically used to. And if you've done a lot of installs like me, you've been doing this for years, and so now it's something you have to change a little bit. Whoops, sorry, went the wrong way. Now, within the configuration as well, there are some differences also, obviously, with the gateway being optional now. You know, if you don't require any of those, using any of those requirements where you need a gateway, and you're going to go without the gateway and use the application servers, content managers, you're going to need a load balancer. And currently, the load balancer, and even if you are using gateways, the load balancer is required if there's more than one application server. If you've got a single application server, you know, you're fine. But as soon as you have a second one, you need to have some way of sending the request to these. You know, in version 10 and prior to that, we're used to Cognos managing that. And even though you could put an a load balancer in between the gateways and the app servers, you know, most people didn't. I mean, I rarely came across customers that actually did that part. They let Cognos do the load balancing for them, and, you know, kind of tweak the different performance settings and, you know, some things like affinity, or they may use the routing rules to control certain requests going to certain servers and so on. But for the most part, they just kind of let it happen. So what we learned here early on was that we needed a second load balancer. You know, we knew we needed the gateway one, but then it was, once we got into this, we realized how we needed the second one. Also, you know, because within Cognos, some of the different requests, there's the affinity request, and some of the requests need to go back to the same server. Like if you're trying to cancel a report, for instance, well, that request needs to go back to the same server where it was started. And so in your load balancer, what you need to do, we need to make sure we set persistence. People refer to them as sticky sessions on your application load balancer, so that the request would go back to the same Cognos server. So that was something else that we learned when we were working on this as well. In the configuration, in Cognos configuration, it looks the same. Most of that, you know, you'll be fine based on your prior experience. One thing that is different, and this actually is a new property even since the GA release, is something called the configuration server property. And what this does is that it identifies the server that's managing the configuration value. So that's typically your active content manager. And so this is something that it's found in your environment settings in Cognos configuration. It's just in the same, just once you get through all your different URLs and setting your content manager path and so on, it's just down below there. And what you'll find on a single install, that's actually empty and it has a little red X on it. And so you can use, there's a reset to default option that you can use on there to actually set it back so that it'll use that server. So that's a new configuration component that's needed. There's a lot of new features within Cognos Analytics, and one of those things is data modules, which allow users to basically kind of create some of their own reporting, not necessarily packages, but it's their own little, it's similar to a package for them to create reports and stuff from. And one of the things that you need to do with that, if your users are going to use that feature, is, and you have more than one application server, so you've got a distributed environment, you need to make sure that you're using some sort of network path for the files and so on, because what happens is they get put in this data files location on the Cognos server. Well, that's not a shared location, and so you need to change it. If it's just a single app server, then you're fine, but as soon as there's a second one, it needs to be changed. And where this gets changed, it's not in the IBM Cognos configuration tool like we're used to changing most of this stuff. And it's not in the administration tool in the browser that we're used to either as well. There's actually a configuration piece in the flyout window menu that's on the left. That's where that path actually gets set. So I'll quickly point out a couple of those things when we look at the interface. Another thing as well, your JDBC files, if you're using JDBC data sources, that location where the JDBC files go, that's changed. It's not the web apps, P2, PD, web INF, lib path anymore. There's actually a drivers folder right up at the install location. So same place where you've got your bin folder, bin 64 configuration, there's a drivers folder. That's where the JDBC files need to go now as well. The web server, for the most part, the configuration is the same. However, there is one major difference, and this has to do with the gateway architecture that they have now. I put links up here for the two typical configurations for web servers, IIS or Apache. So you'll have these available. I've been through them. They've been refined as releases have happened and more installs have happened. When we did our setup, this wasn't available, so we kind of stumbled through it with the IBM lab for a little bit. But the one major difference here is this URL rewrite on your web server. Because of the majority of the gateway is really on your application server, so you need to do this URL rewrite to redirect your web requests from that web tier to the application tier. So that was something that was different as well. Also, when you're configuring IIS as well, there's a couple excuse me, there's a couple different ways it can be configured depending on your need as well. One, you can use something called application request routing extension. That's something that you'll use if you're going to have an external gateway for any part of your IBM Cognos architecture. So your web server is publicly available, or it's outside an external firewall. And if it's not, then we use the one for the SSO integration and so on, just from the static content. Some other considerations when upgrading. In the documentation, IBM says that when you go to install new releases of Cognos 11, they can install right over in the same path as the existing ones that are there. However, we all know that a lot of times we don't really want to do that. We want to actually set up a second, like another environment, whether it's a side-by-side install, because you need to do testing and things like that. You want to upgrade reports, especially when you're going from version 10 to 11. You're going to obviously want to do that because you need to make sure reports work and so on as well. A few things that are different when it comes to the reports. The default path for the images is actually on the application servers because of that glass interface. And there's actually a folder, and this took us a little bit of trial and error figuring out which folder images needed to be in, because we started putting them in the gateway folder like we're used to, couldn't show up. Then we noticed there was a path on the application servers that was the same, put it there, still didn't work, and that was the old web content samples images. Turns out we had to use this web content BI samples images. And then of course you can always create your own virtual path within your web server where you want your images to go as well. The one thing I mentioned already about the load balancer, if you have more than one application server, that's required now. So That's a difference as well. The network path for your data modules that I mentioned as well. And then one thing, if you haven't seen the interface, and I'll bring up the interface here in a minute, for your end users, the user interface is quite different from version 10. It took a little bit of getting used to. I'm actually quite used to it now and actually kind of like it over the old one once you get used to it. There's no IBM Cognos connection. There's just this welcome screen, and it has like toolbars and things like that. There's also just one reporting tool, and they don't have any user interface profiles yet. I'm not sure. I assume that that's probably something that's coming, because that's something that's in version 10 right now, where you can create custom user interface profiles and customize what functionality you want available, either for Workspace Advanced or for Report Studio, and create UI profiles off of those, and then you can secure them and control who uses those. And then when it comes to report, and even just your environment in general, any customized files, and this is typical of any, even prior to 11, you start customizing files and whatnot. Obviously, those are things that you're going to have to recheck as well. Sometimes those files don't even exist anymore. Sometimes they've completely changed the structure or how those files work. One of the reasons I still like to do the side-by-side install even with 11 is because one thing that we ran into and opened a ticket with IBM, and they had a file that they had me modifying to try and rectify the issue. They were checking in a newer release, I think it was 11.02, to see if changing the file there worked and so on. And the support tech found that the file we were trying to modify didn't even exist anymore. So that was something. So that kind of relates to your customized files. The images I mentioned already, the different default paths. So when it comes to your when you're upgrading reports, I've done a bunch of report upgrades, some that we have in our CCG sandbox from customers and so on to do some testing on. For the most part, they've all upgraded pretty seamlessly. There's actually a new property in the report where you can actually get any upgrade error messages, and I'll show that in a minute. So when you come to upgrading, because of the different image path, depending on how you're using your images in your reports, you may have to make some changes there. If you're already using some other virtual path different than what the default IBM Cognos path is, and you set it to be the same, you should be fine. But if you're using the default path and copying images there, you may need to make a few changes there. And like I said, they also reside on the application server as opposed to the gateway, even if you have a gateway installed. Most reports, the only reports that I've ran into with some issues, and this is typical of any upgrade from version to version, was with some HTML and JavaScript. Most of the JavaScript stuff, basic stuff, HTML tags and so on, would work. But occasionally, if you're doing something that's a little too specific to a version, or I have one sample to show where we were actually using a path of the gateway. So that was something that would need to be changed. So those are things that will need to be fixed and so on. And then probably the biggest thing, because of the legacy tools, any reports created in Query, Analysis Studio, and any other legacy tools, any Event Studio stuff you have, those are going to eventually need to be converted to reports by your users. And so when you go into the environment, there actually is, and let me just quickly switch over here. So this is the the interface that you get when you log in. So this is what you see now instead of Cognos Connection, and you'll see along the left here all your different options. I've also in this setup in this sandbox, I also have a source control tool from Modio, if anyone's familiar with that or has that. It does work with 11. We've got it integrated in a couple different places here. So this is where things are quite different. So for instance, under the new, you've got your report, dashboard, and then the new feature data module, and then the other option. When you select other, because I'm in Chrome, I'm just getting my drill through definitions and workspace. If I was on my Firefox or IE browser, I'd also have Query Studio, Analysis Studio, Event Studio listed here as well. For anything that's created in something like Query Studio, for instance, it comes over and upgrades and so on. There's a convert to report option. So your users are going to have to go through and convert these different reports, test them out, make sure they work, and so on. One thing I mentioned earlier about the data modules and the network path, this is the spot for the setting to set the configuration. So it's not in Cognos configuration. It's not in the typical administration console. It's in this configuration option. And so this is where you would set that. This particular install is just a single install, so I've never changed it. So you can see that's the default path on the Cognos server as well. So there are a few administration settings outside of what we're used to as well. Some other things, data servers when it comes to working with data modules as well. You can even monitor your activities and so on. Your administration console, it still looks and works the same, so you don't have anything to worry about there. You can see it's still got the old skinning and the menus are the same and so on. There's not really any new settings there, so that's okay. And then in the reports, and this is where it takes, and it will take your users a bit to start getting used to, this is the reporting tool here. And so in here, you've got your menu over at the left. This is where you can start seeing your data, your toolbox, seeing your report and your queries. So probably one of the biggest things when it comes to upgrading from 10 to 11 will be on the user side, because it's going to take them a little bit to start getting used to and the interface and finding things and so on as well. This was a report where I had there was some JavaScript in it. This one, it works. It's basically allowing you to sort the different columns and so on by clicking the column heading. That one didn't have any problems upgrading. This one did, because you can see up here it's actually using the old gateway path. So there's some things that are going to need to change in order for this to work in my Cognos 11 install, because I'd have to change the gateway path to be the new dispatcher path and so on as well. And actually you can see up here, this was because I've got two installs on the same machine, so I'm using port 9400 for this install. The default is 9300. So this is your URL. It's your server name, the port number you use, /BI. That's your URL by default if you're not using the gateway. So just a quick review here, and then we'll open it up to any questions that people may have. we talked about the installation differences and your options, and again, the places that you'll find this is when you're actually doing the initial setup. The install windows are different. There's some different paths to take. You need to have your content manager up and running when you're doing a custom install and then you do an expansion on it, so that's something that's a little different. Some of the configuration changes that are different, that configuration server property. Currently, the application servers, if there's more than one in a distributed environment, we need to have our load balancer. That will probably change in the future, but I don't know when. I haven't heard anything from IBM about when that will be happening, but I've seen rumors on the internet that it is coming. So, but they weren't IBM, so but I would assume that they probably will, because that's actually been one issue that people have brought up. And then when it comes to the upgrade, the considerations, the typical stuff is still there. Do we want to do a completely new environment, side-by-side install? When it comes to upgrading reports from one version to the next, that process is still the same. The reports and everything still upgrade, pretty seamlessly, and just like in, past releases, if I'm doing a bunch of customization and so on, JavaScript, that sort of thing, that's something that you just have to check. I mean, you had to do that in version 10 as well, so, there's not really any change there. So now, I guess I turn it over to Caroline, and she has some, if anyone has any questions, and then she's got some additional information.
Yes, thanks, Norm, and thank you so much for the presentation. We have a couple questions submitted already, but continue to type those. While you're typing those up in the questions typed to your panel to your right, I just wanted to give you guys a quick little plug for our next upcoming webinar if you're interested in this. It's going to be featuring Watson Analytics on September 27th on the power of predictive. So we've heard weather data and integrating weather was the big news at last year's IBM Insight. So this year we want to really focus on how can you guys make that actionable, how can you actually use weather data yourselves to improve your predictive analysis. So Ahmed Sharif is going to be presenting on September 27th. Registration is now live for that at go.ccgbi.com/weather.html. The link to register for that will be included in the recording of today's webinar. Additionally, just wanted to throw out there that World of Watson is now the new IBM Insight. We're going to be speaking there as well this year and hope to see you guys all there. But registration is now up. So if you're interested in World of Watson, I believe there's still an early bird registration available. So go ahead and register as soon as you can. We will now move on to questions. The first one we have for you, Norm, is have you tried sharing a Cognos Insight workspace with Cognos 11?
No, that I haven't. I haven't tried anything with Cognos Insight with it yet. But that would be a good thing to put on my list.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. The next question is can Analysis Studio reports be converted to reports within Cognos 11?
Yes, because they're all XML based, same report spec. So it's the same tool. It's just it needs to be obviously the multi-dimensional package to report off of with it, and then you just continue on as before.
Great. And the final question we have: are there any changes to the install or configuration of Framework Manager?
No. Framework Manager looks the same. The install configuration of it, it's exactly the same as it's been for years. So the only difference now, and even this was still there, is in prior releases, you could go against your gateway or you could go against your dispatcher, and of course going against the dispatcher directly was usually recommended, especially if you had like larger packages and stuff like that. Obviously now, if you don't have a gateway, you have to go against the dispatcher. So if you don't have the gateway, that's really the only change. And like I said, most people would typically configure against the dispatcher anyway. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Norm. And thank you all again for your questions and for taking the time to join us. Just a refresher, the recording of today's webinar will be emailed to you tomorrow, as well as a copy of all the presentation slides. If you have any additional questions, you think of something after this, you're welcome to email me directly, and I will get them to Norm. That email is listed here for you, cwright@ccgbi.com, or you can tweet at ccgbi.com or ccgbi as well. Thank you guys so much. We'll go ahead and end the webinar now. Have a great rest of your day.